The story of Jacob is one of the most extraordinary narratives in the Bible. It is a tale of struggle, deception, divine encounters, and ultimate transformation. Jacob is not a conventional hero. He is deeply flawed, cunning, and often driven by self-interest. And yet, he is chosen by God. His journey is filled with twists and turns, moments of desperation and triumph, and most importantly, a night that changes everything, a night when he wrestles with God himself. But to truly understand Jacob's incredible transformation, we must go back to the very beginning. Even before he was born, Jacob's life was marked by struggle. His story is a testament to the fact that God often chooses the most unlikely individuals, shaping them through trials and lessons, molding them into the people they were meant to be. His life is not just about personal change, but also about the birth of a nation, as he becomes the father of the 12 tribes of Israel. Jacob's journey is also deeply personal for us today. How often do we wrestle with our own struggles, trying to grasp control of our lives, questioning our purpose, and seeking blessings in the midst of uncertainty? His story mirrors our own battles with faith, fear, and destiny. Through Jacob, we see a reflection of our deepest desires to be loved, to be chosen, and to find meaning in the chaos of life. But before Jacob became Israel, before he received the name that would define an entire nation, he was a deceiver. A man who lived by his wits, who manipulated others to get ahead, and who seemed to believe that success could only come through his own efforts. His name itself means supplanter, or one who takes the place of another, often through deceit. And from the very moment of his birth, he lived up to that name. This is where our journey begins, with a man who fought his way into the world, struggled to secure his future, and ultimately came face to face with God himself. Jacob's story begins even before he takes his first breath. From the very start, his life is marked by struggle, ambition, and conflict. His mother, Rebekah, feels it while he is still in her womb, a restless, ongoing battle between the two sons she carries. The struggle is so intense that she seeks the Lord, asking why this is happening to her. The answer she receives is not just about her two unborn children, but about the destiny of entire nations. 2 nations are in your womb, and 2 peoples from within you will be separated. One people will be stronger than the other, and the older will serve the younger. Genesis 25 verse 23. This prophecy sets the foundation for Jacob's life. He is not just any child. He is born into a divine plan that will shape the course of history. But the way he approaches his destiny will be far from righteous. From the moment of birth, Jacob shows his nature. His twin brother, Esau, comes out first, red and covered in hair, a symbol of his wild, untamed spirit. But Jacob is right behind him, grasping Esau's heel, as if refusing to accept second place. It is this act that gives him his name, Jacob, which means heel grabber or supplanter. Even as a newborn, Jacob's identity is tied to struggle, to the desire to overtake, to not be left behind. And this theme will define his early years. As Jacob and Esau grow up, their differences become even more apparent. Esau is a man of the outdoors, a skilled hunter, favored by his father, Isaac. He is strong, impulsive, and driven by his desires. Jacob, on the other hand, is quieter, staying close to the tents, learning the ways of negotiation and strategy. He is his mother's favorite, and Rebekah, remembering the prophecy from God, sees something greater in him. But Jacob is not one to wait for destiny to unfold on its own. He sees opportunities and takes them, regardless of whether they are right or wrong. And the first major opportunity comes when Esau, after a long day of hunting, returns home exhausted and starving. Jacob has been cooking a stew, a simple meal of lentils. As Esau stumbles into the tent, his hunger overwhelming him, Jacob seizes the moment. "Quick, let me have some of that red stew. I'm famished." Genesis 25 verse 30. Jacob, always calculating, does not give it away freely. Instead, he makes an outrageous demand. "First, sell me your birthright." Genesis 25 verse 31. The birthright is no small matter. It represents leadership of the family, a double portion of inheritance, and most importantly, the spiritual blessing passed down from Abraham. But Esau, ruled by his physical desires, sees only his immediate need. "Look, I am about to die," Esau says. "What good is the birthright to me?" Genesis 25 verse 32. With an oath, Esau gives it away. And Jacob, the younger brother, the one who should have had no claim to leadership, now possesses the rights of the firstborn. It is not theft, but it is certainly manipulation. Jacob has taken advantage of his brother's weakness to get what he wants. Yet, the true test of Jacob's ambition is still to come. While the birthright was Esau's legal inheritance, the blessing of their father, Isaac, held even greater significance. It was a prophetic declaration, a divine transmission of favor and authority. And when Isaac grows old and blind, it becomes clear that the time has come for Esau to receive it. Isaac calls for Esau and instructs him to hunt game and prepare a meal, after which he will bless him. But Rebekah, overhearing the conversation, immediately devises a plan. She knows that Jacob is destined for greatness, and she is willing to deceive her own husband to ensure it happens. She tells Jacob to act quickly, to bring her 2 goats so she can prepare a meal for Isaac. But Jacob hesitates, not because he sees the deception as wrong, but because he fears getting caught. "My brother Esau is a hairy man, and I am a man with smooth skin. What if my father touches me? I would appear to be tricking him and would bring down a curse on myself rather than a blessing." Genesis 27 verse 11 to 12. Rebekah insists, covering Jacob's arms and neck with goat skins, dressing him in Esau's clothing to complete the disguise. With the meal in hand, Jacob approaches his father. "Who is it?" Isaac asks. Jacob responds with a bold lie. "I am Esau, your firstborn." Genesis 27 verse 19. Isaac is uncertain. His senses tell him something is not right. "Come near so I can touch you, my son, to know whether you really are my son Esau or not." Genesis 27 verse 21. Jacob steps closer, and Isaac feels the goat skins, believing them to be Esau's hairy arms. He eats the meal, and then, in a moment that will change everything, he speaks the words of blessing over Jacob. "May God give you heaven's dew and earth's richness, an abundance of grain and new wine. May nations serve you and peoples bow down to you. Be Lord over your brothers, and may the sons of your mother bow down to you." Genesis 27 verse 28 to 29. Jacob has done it. He has secured the blessing meant for Esau. But his triumph is short-lived. No sooner has he left his father's presence than Esau returns, bringing his own meal. When Isaac realizes what has happened, he trembles violently. "Your brother came deceitfully and took your blessing." Genesis 27 verse 35. Esau, filled with rage, pleads for another blessing, but Isaac can only say, "I have made him lord over you, and have made all his relatives his servants." Genesis 27 verse 37. Esau's anger turns to fury. He vows to kill Jacob once their father dies. And Jacob, the deceiver, who thought he had won everything, now finds himself in danger of losing it all. His mother, fearing for his life, urges him to flee to her brother Laban's house in Haran. And so, Jacob, the man who had fought his way to the top through trickery, must now leave everything behind. His journey is far from over. What lies ahead will test him in ways he never expected. The deceiver will soon learn what it feels like to be deceived, and his encounters with God will reshape him completely. Jacob may have stolen a blessing, but his greatest battle is yet to come. Jacob had always been a man of strategy, a planner who carefully positioned himself to gain the upper hand. But now, for the first time in his life, he had no plan. His deception had worked, but it had also set into motion a chain of consequences that he could not control. His brother, Esau, filled with rage, had sworn to kill him. His mother, Rebekah, the one who had guided and protected him, urged him to flee before it was too late. And his father, Isaac, though unaware of the full extent of Rebekah's plan, now sent him away under the pretense of finding a wife among his relatives in Haran. Jacob was not leaving in triumph, nor was he departing with the wealth and honor that a blessed son might expect. Instead, he was running for his life, alone and uncertain of what lay ahead. The tents of his family, the land he had known, the security of his home, everything was behind him now. He had spent his life grasping for power, but now he had nothing but the clothes on his back and the weight of his choices pressing down on him. As he journeyed toward Haran, the road stretched before him, barren and unfamiliar. Each step carried him farther from his past, but also closer to an unknown future. He had always relied on his own cunning, but now, with no one to manipulate, no deals to make, and no schemes to weave, he faced a reality he had never known: helplessness. As night fell, exhaustion overtook him. With no shelter, no comfort, and no protection, he lay down on the hard ground, placing a stone beneath his head for a pillow. The vast sky stretched above him, and for the first time, he was truly alone. This was not the life he had imagined for himself. The blessing he had fought so hard to obtain now seemed distant and empty. But in this place of solitude, something happened. When Jacob drifted into sleep, a vision unfolded before him. He saw a great ladder stretching from the earth to the heavens, and upon it, angels ascended and descended, moving between the realms of God and man. At the top stood the Lord himself, and his voice spoke, cutting through the uncertainty and fear that clouded Jacob's heart. "I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. Your descendants will be like the dust of the earth, and you will spread out to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you and your offspring. I am with you and will watch over you wherever you go, and I will bring you back to this land. I will not leave you until I have done what I have promised you." Genesis 28 verse 13 to 15. Jacob awoke with a start. The vision had been so vivid, so real, that the very ground beneath him felt changed. His heart pounded as he looked around. He was still alone, still on the run, but something was different now. This place, this desolate, empty stretch of land, was no ordinary place. God had been here. The Almighty had spoken to him. Trembling, Jacob whispered, "Surely the Lord is in this place, and I was not aware of it." Genesis 28 verse 16. Fear gripped him. He had heard stories of God's appearances to his grandfather Abraham and to his father Isaac. But now, for the first time, God had spoken directly to him. Not in anger, not in judgment, but in promise. Jacob had done nothing to deserve such an encounter. He was a deceiver, a fugitive, a man whose actions had been guided by self-interest rather than faith. And yet, God had chosen to meet him here, in his lowest moment, not to condemn him, but to assure him of a future. As the first light of dawn broke across the horizon, Jacob rose and took the stone he had used as a pillow, setting it upright as a pillar. He poured oil over it, consecrating the place, and gave it a name, Bethel, meaning house of God, This lonely stretch of wilderness had become sacred ground, not because of anything Jacob had done, but because God had revealed himself here. Then Jacob made a vow. He was still a man of bargaining, still trying to secure his future, but something in him had shifted. If God will be with me and watch over me on this journey I am taking, and will give me food to eat and clothes to wear, so that I return safely to my father's household, then the Lord will be my God. Genesis 28 verse 22-21. It was not yet a declaration of unwavering faith, but it was a step. Jacob was beginning to realize that his destiny was not something he had to manipulate or steal. It was something God himself had promised. The road ahead was still uncertain, and his trials were far from over. But now, he was not walking alone. With renewed strength, Jacob gathered his belongings and set out once more. The path to Haran was long, and he had no idea what awaited him there. But one thing was certain: the God of his fathers had spoken, and his promise would not fail. Jacob had left his home as a fugitive, but he was walking toward something far greater than he could yet understand. The journey was only beginning. Jacob arrived in Haran weary but hopeful. The journey had been long, but the memory of his encounter with God at Bethel gave him strength. He was no longer just a fugitive running from Esau's wrath. He carried a promise now, a future secured by divine assurance. But what he did not yet understand was that the road to that future would be filled with trials of a different kind. He had spent his life outmaneuvering others, but in Haran, he would finally meet his match. As he neared the outskirts of the city, he came upon a well where shepherds gathered with their flocks. There he saw her, Rachel. She was beautiful, graceful, and as she approached to water her father's sheep, Jacob felt something stir within him. He had never known love before, at least not like this. His entire life had been a battle for position, a contest of wit and deception. But now, here in this foreign land, he found something he had never sought. His heart had been captured in an instant. Rachel's father, Laban, welcomed Jacob into his home. As a kinsman, Jacob was given refuge, a place to stay, and in time, an offer. Laban saw Jacob's strength and work ethic, and rather than treating him as a guest, he presented him with a deal. Just because you are my relative, should you work for me for nothing? Tell me what your wages should be. Genesis 29 verse 15. Jacob did not hesitate. I will work for you 7 years in return for your younger daughter, Rachel. Genesis 29 verse 18. 7 years was a long time, but for Rachel, Jacob was willing to endure it. And so he labored day after day, tending the flocks, braving the heat of the day and the cold of the night. But time did not feel like a burden to him. So Jacob served 7 years to get Rachel, but they seemed like only a few days to him because of his love for her. Genesis 29 verse 20. Finally, the years passed, and the day of the wedding arrived. Jacob was eager, filled with anticipation. He had worked, he had waited, and now, at last, he would take Rachel as his wife. But Jacob, the deceiver, was about to taste deception himself. Under the cover of night, with veils and secrecy, Laban replaced Rachel with her older sister, Leah. When morning came, Jacob woke to a shocking reality. When morning came, there was Leah. Genesis 29 verse 25. Betrayal flooded through him. He had spent his life tricking others, but now he had been the one deceived. He confronted Laban, demanding an answer. Why have you deceived me? Genesis 29 verse 25. Laban, with a calmness that mirrored Jacob's own past cunning, simply replied, It is not our custom here to give the younger daughter in marriage before the older one. Genesis 29 verse 26. It was a cruel irony. Jacob had once stolen from his older brother, taking what rightfully belonged to him. Now he found himself on the other side, being forced to accept what he had not chosen. But Laban was not done yet. He offered another deal, work another 7 years, and Rachel would be his as well. Jacob had no choice. He agreed. And so, just 1 week after marrying Leah, he was given Rachel too, though his labor for her was far from over. He toiled for 7 more years, now bound to 2 wives, caught in a web of rivalry and strife that he could not escape. Leah, the wife he had never wanted, longed for his love, but his heart belonged to Rachel. Yet God saw Leah's pain, and he blessed her with children while Rachel remained barren. One by one, Leah bore sons: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah. Each time, she hoped that bearing Jacob's children would make him love her. But Jacob's affection remained with Rachel. Rachel, desperate for a child, could not bear the sight of her sister's growing family. In anguish, she cried out to Jacob, "Give me children, or I'll die." Genesis 30, verse 1. Jacob, frustrated, could do nothing. Am I in the place of God, who has kept you from having children? Genesis 30, verse 2. In her desperation, Rachel followed a familiar custom of the time. She gave her maidservant Bilhah to Jacob as a surrogate, and through her, Rachel claimed 2 sons, Dan and Naphtali. Not to be outdone, Leah did the same with her maidservant Zilpah, who bore Jacob 2 more sons, Gad and Asher. The household was filled with tension, a constant competition between the sisters, each trying to secure their place in Jacob's heart through children. Eventually, Leah bore more children, Issachar and Zebulun, and finally a daughter, Dinah. But Rachel remained childless, watching as the rivalry between the 2 women consumed their lives. Yet God had not forgotten Rachel. In time, he opened her womb, and she gave birth to a son, Joseph, the one who would later become the savior of his people during a great famine. Rachel's joy was boundless, but her struggles were not over. She would bear 1 more son, Benjamin, but in doing so, she would lose her own life in childbirth. Jacob's years in Haran were filled with love, but also with heartbreak. He had come seeking a future, thinking he had found it in Rachel. But instead, he found himself trapped in a life of endless struggle, reaping the very deception he had once sown. He had taken what was not his from Esau, and now he had been forced to accept what he had not chosen. Through it all, God was shaping him. Jacob was learning that the blessings of God could not be gained through trickery or manipulation. The struggles in his household were not just the product of human rivalry, but also a reflection of the deeper struggle within himself. He had spent his life fighting for what he wanted, but now he was beginning to see that his destiny would not come through his own schemes, but through the hand of God. Jacob was no longer just a man on the run. He was a man being refined, molded through hardship, prepared for something far greater. But his greatest challenge was still to come. The day was drawing near when he would have to return home. And waiting for him there was Esau, the brother he had wronged. The night was silent, yet heavy with anticipation. The weight of the past and the uncertainty of the future pressed upon Jacob as he stood alone by the river Jabbok. His family had already crossed ahead of him, his flocks and possessions sent in waves toward Esau, his estranged brother, in a desperate attempt to turn wrath into reconciliation. He had done all he could in his own power, using strategy, gifts, and prayers, but none of it had eased the dread in his heart. He was alone, but he was not abandoned. Something was about to happen, something that would change him forever. Then, out of the darkness, a figure emerged. Jacob did not know who he was, but there was no time for questions. The stranger attacked, and in an instant, Jacob found himself locked in a struggle unlike any he had ever faced. It was a fight that neither side could seem to win. The hours passed, and still the struggle continued, neither man yielding, neither overcoming. It was an exhausting battle, a test of endurance, strength, and will. But this was no ordinary fight. This was something far greater. This was a battle that transcended the physical. It was the culmination of Jacob's entire life, a life marked by struggle, by deception, by wrestling for control. He had wrestled with Esau in the womb, grasping for dominance before he had even taken his first breath. He had wrestled with his brother over a birthright, manipulating his way into a position of favor. He had wrestled with his father, deceiving him to steal a blessing that was not meant for him. He had wrestled with Laban, navigating years of toil and trickery to carve out a future for himself. And now he was wrestling again, but this time it was with God himself. Jacob did not yet understand the full weight of what was happening. He only knew that he could not let go. The struggle was not just about survival. It was about something deeper, something unseen. He was desperate, clinging to this unknown adversary with every ounce of strength he had left. He had always fought for blessings, for security, for identity. But this time, the fight was different. He was not seeking to take something through deceit. He was seeking to be changed. As dawn began to break, the stranger reached out and, with a single touch, dislocated Jacob's hip. Pain exploded through Jacob's body, his strength failing in an instant. The struggle had lasted all night, yet with one touch, the stranger had undone him. This was no ordinary man. This was a divine being, one who had allowed Jacob to wrestle, but who held ultimate power. And now, with a crippling blow, the fight should have been over. But Jacob, though wounded, refused to release his grip. "Let me go, for it is daybreak," the stranger said, but Jacob, panting, his body broken, his will still unshaken, gasped out a response that revealed the deepest longing of his soul. "I will not let you go unless you bless me." Genesis 30 to verse 26. It was a bold statement, one that revealed the essence of who Jacob had always been, a man who refused to let go, who grasped and fought and persisted. But this was not like the blessings he had stolen from Esau or Isaac. This was not something he could manipulate or trick his way into receiving. This blessing had to be given freely. And so the stranger asked him a simple yet profound question. "What is your name?" Jacob answered, "Jacob," and in that moment, everything changed. "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." Genesis 30 to verse 28. Jacob, the deceiver, the one who had spent his life grasping at what was not his, who had wrestled his way through life, trying to carve out his own destiny. But now, God himself had given him a new name, Israel, meaning one who struggles with God and prevails. This was not just a change in name. It was a transformation of identity. Jacob had spent his entire existence trying to claim blessings through his own cunning, but now he had received one that no deception could ever secure. It had come not because he had stolen it, but because he had refused to let go of God. But there was a cost. The injury Jacob sustained was not just a wound, it was a mark, a permanent reminder of this encounter. As the sun rose over the horizon, Jacob limped away from that place. He was not the same man who had arrived at the river Jabbok the night before. His body was weaker, but his spirit was stronger. He had wrestled with God and had been changed. For the rest of his life, Jacob would walk with a limp, a visible sign of the night that altered his destiny. And yet, it was not a mark of defeat, it was a mark of victory. He had fought, not for power or wealth, but for something far greater. And in that struggle, he had found the only blessing that truly mattered. Now, as he limped forward, the next test awaited him. Esau was still coming, but Jacob was no longer the man who had fled from his brother in fear. He was Israel now. And though the outcome was still unknown, he faced the future with a faith that had been forged in the struggle. The sun rose over the horizon, casting its golden light over the river Jabbok. But Jacob was not the same man who had stood on its banks the night before. He had entered the night as Jacob, the deceiver, the trickster, the man who had spent his life grasping for blessings through manipulation and cunning. But now he limped away with a new name, a new identity, and a permanent reminder of his encounter with God. He had wrestled with a divine being, fought with all his strength, and in the end, had been wounded but not defeated. His hip was out of joint, his body weakened, yet his spirit had never been stronger. The name Jacob had defined his past, but the name Israel would define his future. No longer was he just a man trying to seize his destiny by his own means. Now he was a man who had struggled with God and had been transformed by the encounter. Names in the ancient world carried great significance. They were not just labels, but declarations of identity and purpose. To be given a new name by God was a sign of profound change, a new direction, a redefinition of one's purpose. Abraham had once been Abram, but God had changed his name to signify that he would be the father of many nations. Sarah had once been Sarai, but her new name confirmed her role in the divine promise. Now, Jacob had undergone the same transformation. His old name spoke of his past, but his new name pointed to something much greater. For years, Jacob had been a man in conflict, struggling with Esau, deceiving Isaac, outwitting Laban, and even wrestling with his own fears and insecurities. But in wrestling with God, he had reached the heart of his true struggle. It was never just about his brother, his father, or his uncle. His entire life had been a fight to find purpose, to secure blessings, to claim an identity. And now, God had given him what he had been seeking all along. The meaning of his new name, Israel, was profound, one who struggles with God and prevails, but this was not a victory in the way Jacob had once understood it. He had not won by force or by trickery. He had prevailed by refusing to let go, by holding on to God even when he was wounded, even when he was overpowered. His persistence was not in his own strength, but in his desperate need for something greater than himself. This transformation was not just personal. It would shape the future of an entire people. The nation of Israel would carry Jacob's new name, a testament to their own struggles, their own wrestling with God throughout history. They too would face trials, exile, suffering, and redemption. They would falter and fail, yet they would always return to God, always persist, always wrestle with their faith and identity. Jacob's story is the story of Israel, a people who, like their forefather, would strive, struggle, and hold on to the promises of God even when faced with adversity. The limp that Jacob carried from that night was not just a physical injury. It was a sign of transformation, a mark of divine encounter. It was a reminder that he had not prevailed by his own strength, but by surrendering to the one who held his future. As he continued his journey, each painful step was a testimony to the fact that he had been changed. No longer was he defined by deception or fear. He was Israel now, a man who had met God face to face and had lived. A man who would carry forward the covenant of Abraham and Isaac. A man who, despite his flaws, was chosen to be the father of a great nation. But before he could fully step into this new identity, one more test remained. Esau was still waiting. Would his brother receive him with vengeance or with mercy? The moment of truth was near, and Jacob, though forever changed, would have to face the consequences of his past. But this time, he would not face them as the man he had once been. He would face them as Israel, the man who had wrestled with God and had been made new. Jacob's limp was a constant reminder of what had happened at the river Jabbok. Every step he took toward Esau was a step of faith, a step of surrender, a step away from the man he had once been. The fear that had gripped him the night before still lingered, but something had shifted within him. He was no longer Jacob the deceiver. He was Israel, the one who had wrestled with God and prevailed, not through force, but through surrender. As he lifted his eyes, he saw Esau in the distance, moving toward him with 400 men. His heart pounded. The moment he had dreaded for 20 years had arrived. Would Esau still hate him? Would this be his end? Would all that he had worked for, his family, his wealth, his future, be destroyed in an instant? He had stolen the blessing, fled in fear, and lived with the weight of his past for decades. Now there was nowhere left to run. Jacob took action, not as a trickster scheming for an advantage, but as a man humbled by his journey. He arranged his family in groups, placing Rachel and Joseph last, his most beloved, his greatest treasures, in the safest position. Then, instead of hiding behind them, he did something he had never done before. He stepped forward first. He bowed to the ground 7 times as he approached his brother, a display of deep humility and submission. It was an act of reverence, a plea for peace, a gesture that said, "I am no longer the man who wronged you." And then something happened that Jacob could never have predicted. Esau ran to meet him. He did not draw his sword. He did not speak words of judgment or demand repayment for the past. He ran toward Jacob, and before Jacob could say a word, Esau embraced him. The brother he had wronged, the one he had feared for so long, wrapped his arms around him. Tears fell freely as Esau kissed him, and they both wept. Genesis 33, verse 4. For 20 years, Jacob had carried the weight of guilt and dread. He had imagined this moment 1,000 times, preparing for the worst, expecting Esau's anger to have hardened into vengeance. But now, standing in his brother's embrace, he saw something he had never expected: grace. Esau did not need gifts. He did not need apologies. His heart had already been softened. Whatever wounds had been inflicted in the past, time and God's unseen work had healed them. "Who are these with you?" Esau asked, looking at the family Jacob had brought with him. Jacob, still overwhelmed, replied, "They are the children God has graciously given your servant." Genesis 33, verse 5. Esau had once been the strong one, the hunter, the man who relied on his own strength. But now it was Jacob who understood what true strength meant. He had learned that blessings were not something to steal or manipulate. They were something given by God's grace. Jacob urged Esau to accept the gifts he had sent ahead, a token of peace, a way of making amends. At first, Esau refused. "I have enough, my brother. Keep what you have for yourself." Genesis 33, verse 9. But Jacob insisted, "No, please. If I have found favor in your eyes, accept this gift from me. For to see your face is like seeing the face of God, now that you have received me favorably." Genesis 33, verse 10. It was a profound statement. Jacob had just wrestled with God, had seen him face to face, and lived. Now, looking into the eyes of his brother, the very brother he had deceived, he saw something divine: forgiveness, mercy, redemption. It was the face of God, not in wrath, but in grace. Esau accepted the gifts, and though their paths would soon separate again, the moment had already done its work. Jacob had feared destruction, but instead, he had found peace. This reunion was not just the resolution of a family dispute. It was the completion of Jacob's transformation. The man who had once relied on deceit now stood in humility. The man who had once fled in fear now walked forward in faith. The man who had once stolen a blessing now understood that true blessing could never be taken. It could only be given. This moment also echoed something far greater. It was a picture of God's own grace. Just as Jacob expected wrath but found mercy, so too do we stand before God, guilty, unworthy, carrying the weight of our failures. And yet, instead of condemnation, we find open arms. Instead of judgment, we find grace. Jacob had seen the face of God, and he had lived. Now he had seen the face of Esau, and he had been forgiven. His journey, once driven by fear and ambition, had led him to this place of peace. As the sun continued to rise, Jacob knew that this was not the end of his journey. There were still challenges ahead, still trials to face. But he walked forward, limping but transformed, marked forever by the struggles that had made him into the man he was meant to be. He had wrestled with God. He had faced his past. And now he walked into his future, not as Jacob the deceiver, but as Israel, the man who had struggled and prevailed. Jacob's story is more than an ancient tale of struggle and redemption. It is the story of all of us, of every person who has wrestled with fear, doubt, failure, and faith. His journey mirrors our own battles with identity, purpose, and the desire for blessings that seem just out of reach. He was a man who fought to define his own destiny, who grasped and deceived, who ran from the consequences of his past, only to find himself face to face with the living God. How often do we, like Jacob, try to take control of our own lives, believing that if we just work hard enough, strategize cleverly enough, or push forward forcefully enough, we will secure the future we want? How often do we wrestle in the night, not just with our fears, but with God himself, questioning his plans, resisting his direction, holding on to our own ways even when we know they are leading us astray? Jacob's transformation is a reminder that true blessings do not come from manipulation or self-sufficiency. They come from surrender. His life was a constant struggle, but it was in his greatest moment of weakness, when his hip was dislocated, when he could no longer fight in his own strength, that he finally received the blessing that would define him forever. He had spent years trying to gain power, but in that one moment of desperate clinging, he learned that the greatest power comes not from striving, but from holding on to God. And that is our story too. We fight our own battles against fear, against sin, against the weight of our past. We wrestle with our faith, asking questions, seeking answers, sometimes resisting what God is trying to do in us. But God does not abandon us in our struggle. He meets us in it. He allows us to wrestle with him, not to destroy us, but to shape us, to refine us, to bring us to the point where we finally understand that we cannot walk this journey alone. Jacob limped for the rest of his life, marked forever by his encounter with God. But his limp was not a sign of weakness. It was a sign of transformation. It was a reminder that he had met God face to face and had been changed. We too carry the marks of our encounters with God. The trials that humble us, the moments of brokenness that draw us closer to him, the struggles that remind us that we are not in control, these are the very things that make us who we are. Jacob's new name, Israel, became the name of an entire nation, a people who, like their forefather, would wrestle with God, struggle through trials, and yet remain his chosen people. And today, that legacy continues. We are all part of that wrestling, all part of that transformation. We are all called to let go of our old selves, to embrace the identity that God has for us, to trust in his promises rather than our own strength. Jacob's story teaches us that no matter how far we have wandered, no matter what we have done, no matter how much we have tried to force our own way, God is still willing to meet us. He is still willing to bless us. He is still willing to give us a new name, a new identity, a new future. We may wrestle, we may struggle, We may limp from the wounds of our past, but in the end, if we hold on to God, if we refuse to let go of Him, even in our brokenness, we will find the same truth that Jacob found on the banks of the Jabbok. Our greatest victory comes not from winning the fight, but from refusing to let go. If this message spoke to you, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future content. Give this video a like to help more people see it, and share your thoughts in the comments below. How has Jacob's story impacted your own journey of faith? Lastly, send this video to your friends and family so they too can be encouraged by this powerful message of perseverance and transformation. Thank you for watching, and may you continue to walk in faith, knowing that even in your struggles, God is with you.